Imagine a man who has not slept in 3 days, not 3 hours of restless turning, not a night cut short by an early meeting. 3 days of lying on a cold stone floor in a mission house in northern Ontario, weeping until there was nothing left to weep, then weeping again because something inside him refused to be quiet and refused to be satisfied with anything the world had already handed him. His hands were shaking. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Outside, the wind was pulling at the pines the way it does in February in that part of the country, low and constant and indifferent. And in the silence between gusts, he heard something. Not a voice exactly, more like a direction, more like a pressure behind the sternum that a man either obeys or spends the rest of his life running from. He was 23 years old. He had no money, no formal theology degree, no denominational support, no plan. What he had was a tambourine his mother had given him when he was 12, a worn King James Bible with the spine repaired twice with carpenter's tape, and a conviction that had been burning in him since he was a boy watching his father die slowly in a mining camp outside Sudbury, asking God questions that nobody in their mining camp church knew how to answer. His name was Murdoch Finlay Beaton. And before you assume he was exceptional, understand precisely what kind of exceptional he was. He was the second of 5 children born to Alastair and Catriona Beaton, Scottish immigrants who had come to Canada through Halifax in 1901 with 2 trunks, a handful of Gaelic prayers, and a determination that their children would not grow up in the Hebrides, watching the fishing industry collapse around them. They settled eventually in the Sudbury Basin, where Alastair found work in the nickel mines. The pay was enough. The cough that came with it was not something anyone discussed. Murdoch was born in 1907 in a 2-room house at the edge of the bush. His earliest memories were of his mother reading aloud by lamplight, her voice moving through the Psalms in Gaelic while the wind knocked at the single-pane windows, and his father sat in the corner chair with his eyes closed, breathing in a way that sounded like paper tearing very slowly. His mother, Catriona, was not a soft woman. She was the kind of woman who prayed the way other people worked, with focus and without sentiment, on her knees every morning before the stove was lit, every evening after the children were in bed, and in between, under her breath, as a matter of continuous practice. She told Murdoch once, when he was perhaps 9 years old, that prayer was not something you did when things went wrong. Prayer was the atmosphere a human being was designed to live inside, the way a fish was designed to live in water. Take the fish out of the water, and it can flip around on the dock for a while. It might even look busy. But it is dying. She said this without drama over a pot of oatmeal, and then went back to stirring. Alastair Beaton died in the autumn of 1919. Murdoch was 12. There was no dramatic deathbed scene, no final revelation. His father simply did not come home from the morning shift, and by the time they brought him back, the cough had taken what was left. The family buried him in the Anglican churchyard at the edge of town. The minister said appropriate things. The congregation sang a hymn, and Murdoch stood at the graveside in a coat 2 sizes too small, staring at the pile of November earth, feeling something harden inside him that was not grief exactly. It was a question he could not articulate yet, but could feel in his chest like a splinter that had gone too deep to reach. Why does a man pray his whole life and still die coughing in a mine shaft? He did not leave the church over this question. He went deeper into it. This is the thing about Murdoch Beaton that his contemporaries would later struggle to explain. He responded to unanswered questions not with abandonment, but with pursuit. He read everything he could get from the church's library, which was not much. He read everything the traveling minister left behind. He wrote letters at 14 to a theological college in Toronto, asking for a reading list, and received back a polite note, informing him that their programs were for men who had completed secondary education. He wrote back thanking them and continued reading on his own. At 16, he began holding a small prayer meeting in the Beaton kitchen on Thursday evenings. 3 neighbors came the first week. By the 3rd week, 11 people were crowded around the table and spilling into the hallway. His mother made tea. Nobody asked him who had authorized him to do this. The authorization was evident. He left Sudbury at 19 to look for work, and found it on the Canadian Pacific rail lines, which took him west through Ottawa, and then back east again, and then north into territory he had never seen. The boreal stretch above Lake Superior where the tree line thinned, and the lakes appeared between rock outcroppings like mirrors dropped by careless giants. He carried his Bible, and he carried his tambourine. And wherever the rail crews camped, within a few weeks he had started something. Not a church. He would have been uncomfortable with the word. A gathering. A place where men who worked with their hands and rarely spoke about anything that mattered sat together and asked the questions that rail work and logging and the particular silence of the Canadian North had generated in them. He prayed for 2 men who were sick and both recovered faster than the camp doctor expected. Word traveled the way word travels in isolated places, quickly and with embellishment. Murdoch accepted neither the credit nor the embellishment. He redirected both every time without making a show of redirecting. By 22, he had made his way to the mission network in northern Ontario, run by a consortium of Protestant churches who were attempting to serve Indigenous and immigrant communities scattered across 200,000 square kilometers of difficult terrain. He had no credentials to offer them. What he had was a 6-year track record in places that credentials could not reach, and a quality of attention when he listened to people that several of the older mission workers described, independently and without consulting each other, as something they could not fully account for by natural means. He was given a probationary assignment at a small mission station outside a town called Nikina. He was told to assist the senior worker, a man named Reverend Archibald, and to avoid doing anything independently until further notice. He assisted. He avoided. He prayed in the early hours before anyone else was awake on his knees on the plank floor, and he waited. The waiting lasted 8 months. Then Reverend Archibald was recalled to Toronto for health reasons, and the mission board, facing a coverage gap they had no one to fill, asked Murdoch to lead services temporarily. Temporarily lasted 3 years. The station grew. People came from settlements 40 kilometers away. An Ojibwe elder attended one evening and stayed for 3 hours and came back the following week with 4 members of his family. A woman who had not spoken in 2 years following the death of her child came to one of the prayer meetings and began, haltingly, to speak. Murdoch prayed with her, not over her, and the distinction was evident to everyone in the room. The mission board noticed. They offered him a formal appointment. They also handed him a condition. He would need to complete an approved certificate program in biblical studies, offered twice a year in Toronto, and he would need to submit all future plans for evangelistic outreach to the board for approval before implementation, given, they wrote in careful language, the sensitive nature of cross-cultural ministry in Indigenous communities. Murdoch read the letter twice. He prayed for 3 days. He wrote back respectfully declining the condition about the certificate, but expressing his willingness to correspond regularly with the board and accept their guidance on matters of policy. The board responded with a formal letter of concern. He responded with a formal letter of appreciation for their concern. This exchange continued for several months until the board, facing other more urgent crises elsewhere in the country, quietly let the matter drop. He stayed at Nikina. He built nothing official. He organized nothing that required a building permit or a budget line. What he did was this. He prayed, and he listened, and he showed up, and over time, the community around that mission station became something that the board's quarterly reports were entirely unable to describe, because the reports had no category for it. Then the letter arrived. It came from the Presbyterian Mission Committee in Toronto, which had been asked by a sister organization to identify workers who might be considered for a new initiative, a coordinated effort to bring together the scattered evangelical fellowships that had been proliferating across northern Ontario without structure or mutual support for 2 decades. The initiative would require someone willing to travel extensively, live without a fixed base for potentially years, and operate under the authority of a newly formed oversight committee that would include representatives from 4 different denominations. Murdoch was 20. He had been in Nikina for 3 years. He had no family requiring him to stay. He had developed something at the station that functioned without him, which he had always understood to be the goal. He went to God with the letter, and did not come out of that room for 2 days. On the second evening, a woman from the station, a Cree woman named Veronique, whose family had attended the prayer meetings since the second year, knocked on the door and handed him a bowl of soup without saying anything, and went back to her house. He ate the soup on the floor of the mission room, sitting cross-legged, and he wept and then he prayed. And then somewhere in the early hours of the third morning, he had his answer. It was not what he expected. It was never in his experience what you expected. He accepted the appointment. He loaded everything he owned into a canvas pack. He left Nikina on a Tuesday morning in April 1933, in the early years of the Depression, when the Canadian economy had contracted so severely that the social fabric in some communities had simply dissolved. The train out of Nikina was carrying relief supplies and men who had lost everything and were moving without destination, because movement at least resembled hope. Murdoch moved among them. He prayed for a man whose wife had died in childbirth 2 weeks earlier. He prayed with a young Métis man who had not eaten in 4 days. He translated, badly, in 3 languages simultaneously. He arrived at his first assignment in a town called Hearst, with a pack, a Bible, a tambourine, and $14, which was all the Oversight Committee had been able to provide as an initial stipend. What followed over the next 7 years is the part of the story that resists summary. Not because it is complicated, but because it is the kind of thing that only makes sense if you understand what was happening in its individual moments. A town here, a lumber camp there, a reserve community a day's travel by dog sled from the nearest road. Murdoch did not build institutions. He did not plant churches in the formal sense. He gathered people. He prayed with them. He taught them to pray. He left behind a culture in each place rather than a structure, and the culture was specific. You got on your knees. You brought what was actually true about your situation. You stayed until something shifted, and then you went and did what you heard. The healings became the part of the story people told most often, and the part Murdoch himself talked about least. A trapper brought in on a hand-built stretcher by his sons, both legs infected following an accident, the camp doctor in Cochrane having said he would not likely keep both limbs. Murdoch prayed through the night, alone in the room with the man, on his knees on a wooden floor. In the morning the infection had retreated in a way the same doctor, when he returned, could not explain and documented carefully, apparently unable to decide whether documentation would help or harm his professional reputation. A child born early, not expected to survive the week. A woman in Smooth Rock Falls, who had been mute for 7 months following a thing she had witnessed that no one would name clearly in any of the accounts that survived. In each case, the pattern was the same. Murdoch did not perform. He disappeared into the prayer and something happened that was not him. When people tried to make him the story, he redirected them, every time. Without making a show of the redirection, the Oversight Committee watched all of this from Toronto, and was, depending on which committee member you asked, either deeply encouraged or deeply uncertain. The encouraged ones pointed to the spread of evangelical fellowship across a region that had been essentially inaccessible. The uncertain ones pointed to Murdoch's habit of cooperating with Catholic priests and Pentecostal, lay workers and indigenous spiritual leaders in ways that did not fit any of the 4 denominations' formal positions on ecumenism. In 1938, the committee called him to Toronto for a formal review. He came. He sat in a wood-paneled room on King Street West, with 7 men who had never been north of Barrie, and answered their questions for 4 hours with patience and without defensiveness, and without yielding a single thing he believed God had told him. When they asked him to sign a statement of practice that would have formalized the restrictions they were concerned about, he read it carefully, thanked them sincerely for their care for the work, and told them he could not sign it. The room went quiet. One of the committee members, a man named Dr. Crawford who had spent 30 years in denominational administration, said afterward that in all his years of reviewing mission workers, he had never encountered anyone who refused a committee directive with such complete absence of either aggression or anxiety. He said it was as if Murdoch simply did not need anything from them. Not their approval, not their financial support, not their validation. It was, Dr. Crawford said, profoundly unsettling. The committee did not resolve anything in that meeting. They asked Murdoch to return to his work and await further communication. He returned. He awaited. No communication came that year, or the following year. and by 1940 the war had reorganized everyone's priorities entirely, and the formal review was never formally concluded. Murdoch continued. The Depression ended. The war reshaped the North in ways that brought new communities and new displacements, and new populations of men and women carrying things they could not put down. He was there for all of it. He was 42 when the war ended and had not slept in a bed he could call his own for 12 years. The letter that changed the final chapter of his life arrived in the summer of 1950, addressed to him at a postal station in Timmins, forwarded from 3 previous addresses. It was from a woman named Marguerite Okalik, who ran a small evangelical fellowship in a community outside Musini, on the western shore of James Bay. She had been trying to reach him for 2 years. She had heard about his work from a man in Hearst, who had heard it from a woman in Kapuskasing, who had heard it from one of the original Nikina families. She wrote to ask whether he would consider visiting their community and sharing what he knew about prayer. He visited. He did not leave for 6 years. The community outside Musini was what you might call, if you were being careful with language, a community that had been failed by almost every institution that had ever attempted to engage with it. The residential school system had done what it did. The denominational missions had come and gone and left behind buildings that leaked and memories that were worse than the leaks. What remained was a group of people, predominantly Cree, who had maintained something across generations by hiding it carefully and refusing to let the institutions touch it, a practice of seeking God in silence, on their knees in the early hours, that looked from the outside like nothing in particular, and from the inside like everything. Murdoch recognized it immediately. He had been doing something similar his entire life. He did not teach them. This is important. He sat among them and prayed and listened, and they prayed and listened, and what developed between them was not a program or a mission or an initiative. It was a mutual recognition. They already knew what he knew. They had maintained it under different language and in different form, and at great cost and with extraordinary fidelity. He told the committee in Toronto, in a letter he knew they would struggle to categorize, that the most significant spiritual formation of his life had happened in a community that no mission report had ever successfully described. They wrote back with an appreciative letter and a polite suggestion that he ensure his theological framing remained within evangelical parameters. He wrote back thanking them. He stayed. By the time Murdoch Beaton left Musini in the spring of 1956, he was 48 years old, moving more slowly than he once had, and carrying something in his face that people who had known him in his 20s recognized as the same fire but older, settled deeper, like coals rather than kindling. He had been asked to join a new initiative, this one broader than anything the Northern Ontario Network had attempted. A circuit of evangelical communities stretching from James Bay down through the river corridor communities of Quebec and into the isolated settlements of Labrador. He packed his canvas pack. He picked up his tambourine. He was observed by a young woman from the Musini community who had known him since she was 11 years old, to pause at the edge of the road before climbing into the truck that was taking him to the train. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he lifted his head and got in the truck. He was never not in motion after that. The Quebec communities took 2 years. Labrador took 3 more. He prayed in French and in Inuiman and in English, and once, memorably, in a combination of all 3 simultaneously, which the people present reported was perfectly coherent. He lived in whatever space was available, a cot in a mission room, a floor in a kitchen, the back seat of a truck during the long drives between settlements. He ate what was offered and was grateful for it, and never commented on its quality or quantity. In 1962, he was traveling between 2 communities in Labrador when the vehicle he was in went off a logging road in conditions that the driver later described as the kind of thing that should have killed everyone in it. 3 other people in the truck walked away from the accident, with injuries ranging from cuts to a broken wrist. Murdoch sustained damage to his spine that left him, after surgery in a hospital in Goose Bay, walking with a permanent and significant limp. He recovered in the hospital for 6 weeks. The nurses on the ward noted that he prayed through the night consistently and without apparent disturbance to his recovery, and that other patients in the ward, without being invited to do anything, began doing the same until, by the third week, there was a nightly prayer gathering in the common room that the ward staff had not organized and did not quite know how to categorize but chose not to discourage. He returned to the work with his limp and his tambourine, and the same forward quality of attention that had characterized everything he did. The limp slowed him physically. Nothing else slowed him. He was 61 when his heart began to give him trouble. He had been in Labrador for the better part of a decade by then, and the communities he had gathered around prayer in that decade were unlike anything the Northern Network had seen in terms of their durability. Not because he had built structures, but because he had built culture. He had done what his mother had done at the kitchen table with the oatmeal, treating prayer as atmosphere rather than event. And the people he left behind had internalized it the same way he had, as a practice so embedded in daily life that it did not require his continued presence to persist. His heart attack came in March 1968 in a community called Northwest River. He survived it. He was told by the cardiologist in Goose Bay with significant firmness that he needed to rest. He rested for 3 months. He then wrote to the network to say he was returning to limited travel and asked for assignments within a reasonable distance of medical facilities. The network, which had by then understood that arguing with Murdoch Beaton was an exercise in spending energy you could have used for something that would actually produce a result, provided the assignments. He died on a Thursday morning in October 1971 in a small mission house in the Labrador interior, 63 years old, dressed for travel. His canvas pack was by the door. His tambourine was on the table. He had been scheduled to leave that morning for a 3-day circuit of communities along the river. The woman who found him, one of the Cree elders from the community who had come to walk with him to the road, said that he looked, in her words, like a man who had sat down briefly on the way out the door and simply not needed to get back up. There was no denomination that claimed him as a founder. There was no institutional structure that bore his name. What there was, stretching from the Sudbury Basin north through Nikina and Hearst and Cochrane and Kapuskasing and Timmins and Musoni, and then east along the river corridors of Quebec and across the Labrador interior, was a series of praying communities that had been formed not around a theology or a program, but around a posture. Knees on the floor, hands open, shut, waiting. The woman who had watched him get into the truck in Musini in 1956, who was by 1971 a grandmother and one of the most respected prayer leaders in the James Bay corridor, said at the gathering that the communities held in his memory that Murdoch Beaton had taught her one thing, and it was the only thing, and it was this: that God was not reluctant, that the one who made you was not waiting to be convinced of your worthiness, that you could come exactly as you were and stay as long as you needed and expect to be met. She had watched him act on this for 15 years and she had never seen it fail. 40 years after his death, the network of praying communities he had catalyzed across the Canadian subarctic included over 200 gathering points, no two of them identical, none of them formally connected by anything other than a shared practice and a shared story. No headquarters, no newsletter, no annual conference, no one with a title that other people deferred to. Just people in small northern communities, in kitchens and mission rooms and tents during summer convocations, on their knees in the dark, waiting for the same thing Murdoch Beaton had waited for on a cold plank floor in Nikina in 1930, while the February wind moved through the pines. The fire he carried is still burning in those places. The question he spent his life answering is still the only question worth asking. Not whether God will meet you, but whether you are willing to stay long enough on your knees to find out.